visitors. Me and my dog are going to be cooking something for you today. I don't believe in asking students to do something that I won't do myself, so I'm going to do a medieval dish. Not exactly medieval, but very English, and this certainly isn't a dish for royalty, so you won't see the same spices that are in a lot of the English things that were on the form of curry. Rather, I've got a bit of skirt steak, which can be a bit of a tough meat, and so I'm going to use that to make a Cornish pasty. And it's seasoned only with salt and pepper. But of course, as you know from Dr. Annie Gray, how important salt and pepper was. Now, the Cornish pasty is a particular dish. It's baked in a pastry case, a coffin, and there's a hard crimped edge around it. And this was actually a dish for the coal miners. Now, the miners' hands would be very dirty, so they wouldn't want to touch their food because it would leave coal dust all over their food. So they would hold the Cornish pasty by the hard crust, and they would eat the soft crust and eat the meats and the potatoes that were in the pastry. And then their darkened, blackened pastry crimp would be thrown away. Now, of course, we're using much more delicate flour because we're in the 21st century. I'm using a combination of self-raising flour, which is common in England, but that's going to make the pastry puff up. So I'm going to cut that with some plain flour, which is going to stop it from rising too much. Because I want the pastry to be light, but I don't want it to be very light. And it's a little bit artificial to be using such refined flour. The other thing is the crust should be made with suet or lard. Harder to come by, so I'm using a different animal fat, that's butter. But whatever shortening agent that you have will work. So my Cornish pasty is going to be for the 21st century because it's going to be made with refined flours and butter rather than coarse flours and animal fat. But otherwise, it's going to be fairly traditional, using only root vegetables, a bit of beef, salt and pepper for flavoring, and some onions. So I've cut up the flour into a bowl, and I've put in some small pieces of butter, which I'm going to work quickly with. I'm not going to use a food processor. You can make your pastry with a food processor, but we're going to do this an old-fashioned way because, hell, why not? That's the whole project, isn't it? So I'm going to pinch the flour and the butter together, working relatively quickly, trying to work just with my fingertips. I want to keep the flour as aerated as possible as I work. And I'm going to keep doing this for about 2 minutes until I get something that looks like breadcrumbs, something that's a little bit coarse. You'll see the flour actually changes color as it becomes incorporated with the butter. You'll also notice that I'm turning the bowl with my hands so that I'm always working at different parts of the flour. Flour has what we call gluten in it, and the more you work the flour, the tougher the pastry will get. So you do want to do this relatively quickly, and you don't want to be overworking the flour. The other thing about doing it this way is I'm putting air into the flour. And so I'm going to keep doing this until I've got something that looks like coarse breadcrumbs, and I'll show you when that is ready. And there you go. So the flour is incorporated with the butter, and I'll still have some pieces of butter, and that's okay. I don't mind that, because those little flat pieces of butter will actually melt into the flour, and that's what causes the pastry to be flakier. The inconsistency in the butter pieces. Some of it being more oily, some of it being more incorporated. So that'll do me for my flour. Now, it's not a pastry dough yet. I have to add a little bit of cold water, which I'm going to take from my medieval fridge. So I'm going to want about 5 tablespoons, maybe 6, of cold water that I'm going to put into my flour and butter mixture, and then I'm going to stir that up. I'm going to stir that up with a knife. To me, that works like a food processor, but it also stops my hands from touching the flour, and that'll stop the gluten from coming out because my hands are quite warm. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tablespoons of cold water. I might put it a little bit more. And I'm just going to stir that with the knife, scraping the edges and turning the bowl as I cut. So I'm cutting with the knife and turning the bowl. And you'll see that the wet flour will start to stick together. Now as it starts to resemble oatmeal, I will then start to pull it together into a ball myself with my hands. But I'm not going to work it much more than this. So there I've got my pastry ball. It's a little dry still, but that's okay. I'm going to put that in my medieval fridge and let that chill out for half an hour, and then I'm going to take it out and let it cool for 20 minutes. Wrap it in cling film, that medieval ingredient. So now I'm going to prepare the filling of my pastry. I have, as I said, a bit of flank steak, which is a little bit tougher, but that's okay because you'll see why in a minute. And I've got my vegetables, all root vegetables. I've got a couple of parsnips, which are British, a carrot, which is actually not a done thing in a Cornish pasty, because carrots are orange because they represent William of Orange. And of course, this was a color that was associated with the enemy, the Danish. I'm using a couple of brown onions, and I'm using potatoes. Choose a waxier potato with a lower starch count and a low moisture count. These are going to cook in the pastry for about 50 minutes. And so if you use a really starchy potato, they're going to just turn into mush. So you want something that's got a low moisture content and that's a little bit waxy, and they keep their shape a little bit better. We're cooking all of the ingredients raw in the pastry, and remember, in the medieval period, that's precisely why they used pastries, to damp down the ferocious heat of their ovens, which were stoked by wood fires. So they couldn't control the temperature of the oven, but they could, however, control the temperature of what was in the oven. So by encasing meat and vegetables in pastry, the meat is cooking at a cooler temperature than the hot oven can provide because the pastry is absorbing that heat. Now, of course, we're going to eat our pastry, so we're going to use a relatively cool oven, about 190 degrees, 180 degrees. So I'm going to chop these up, and then we're going to roll out the pastry and start filling that. Okay, I've got everything cut up now, so I've cut my steak into cubes, and I've cut the parsnip, the onions, the potato, and the carrots all into similar sizes. I've also got a little bit of flour here. Now I'm actually using corn flour here because the only baking flour I've got left is that self-raising flour, and that's got a little bit of baking powder and baking soda in it, and I don't want to use that in the filling because it's going to add an astringent flavor. So I'm using corn flour instead, and that's going to help make the gravy that comes out of the sweated onions and the meat. So that's going to actually thicken the filling of the pie. And I'm just going to mix everything together. I'm just going to put it all into this bowl. So my potatoes, carrots, onions, parsnip, and the meat. I'm going to add my corn flour. I'm going to put in a big pinch of salt. I'm using coarse salt, and in fact this is sea salt from Cornwall. So that's going to give it a nice flavor. And I'm putting in quite a generous amount of salt. Potatoes can absorb a surprising amount of salt, and I've got a lot of potato in there. And I'm going to put in a big pinch of coarse pepper. So the key ingredients to this dish is salt and pepper. And in fact, I'm going to add one more pinch of this coarse salt for good luck. I'm actually being fairly generous with the salt. This is sea salt flakes that's taken out of the British Ocean at Cornwall. But I find that this salt is very mild. If you're going to use coarse mined salt, I would use considerably less. And if you're going to use refined table salt, I would use less of that still. So this I'm being quite generous with because it's got a very mild saltiness. I like this one because the flakes, rather than the crystals, melt a little bit into the meat, and they also help to draw out the flavors of the meat juices. And I'm just going to mix this all together into a homogeneous mix. Now, because this is a working man's dish, it's considerably more vegetable than meat. The meat's still going to be quite present in the pie. It's going to certainly lend its flavor, it's certainly going to lend its gravy, but this is peasant food, and so it's going to be predominantly a vegetable dish with a little bit of meat. These dishes were designed to make what little meat you had go as far as possible with the pastry and the vegetables. So there we go. So all incorporated. And I'm going to leave that while my oven heats up to get to a good temperature. Well, my oven's hot and my pastry has been resting. It was in the fridge for 20 minutes and then I took it out to bring it back up to room temperature for 20 minutes. It's been about 40 minutes, so that means that the moisture is spread throughout the pastry. I've portioned out my meat and veg into 3 portions because I'm going to make 3 of these, so it's all equal amounts. I've got a little bit of milk that I'm going to use to wash the dough, and I've got a little bit of butter that I'm going to put in as well. And otherwise that's it. The oven is quite hot. It's at 220 degrees Celsius, maybe 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to put the Cornish pasties into the hot oven, and that's going to give a nice crust. But I'm immediately going to turn the oven down to about 180, 170 degrees Celsius, so maybe 320 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. A cool oven because it's going to be a slow bake. And what that does is it kind of replicates the way a wood-fired oven would work. You stoke the fire, the wood gets hot, you put the food in, and then you let it cook, but as the wood burns through, the fire becomes cooler, the oven becomes cooler. So that's pretty authentic there. So I'm going to roll out the dough into 3 discs, and then I'm going to fill them. Form the dough into a log, and then I'm going to break it into 3 pieces. Right, so my 3 balls are about the same size, and that's going to mean that I'll have 3 good size Cornish pasties. So put these 2 aside. I'm going to press that into a disc. Flour on the top, flour on the bottom, flour on the counter, and I'm just going to roll that out. I'm looking for about 5 millimeters thick. Should be a workable size and a workable thickness. I don't want it too thin because my Cornish pasties are going to bake in the pastry and it's going to be in there for quite a long time. I've also got vegetables that are a little sharp, like carrots and parsnip, so I don't want them to pierce the pastry. I would take a plate and trim off the excess and make nice round circles. Fold it over, 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 fold it over. And then put it on the side. Nice ones. So there's my 3 Cornish pasties. Now I've got a brush here and some milk. I'm going to give it a milk wash. And that actually helps the pastry brown a bit nicer. And I'm actually going to do this 3 times while it's cooking. And that's going to give it a lovely color. ready to go in the oven. So bang it in the oven. There's my 3 Cornish pasties in the oven, hot oven. Take the temperature down. And that's it. I'm going to leave it 50 minutes and I'll come back. Well, it's been 50 minutes. Let's see what we've got. Nice and browned. They're going to need to rest for a bit. I'll be back in 20 minutes. So there we have it. We have our traditional Cornish pasties. And let's cut into one and see how it is. And there we go. The meat and the potato is all cooked on the inside. The coffin is nicely browned. And the meat should be soft and tender. So I'm going to enjoy this with a glass of wine. And maybe you can give a Cornish pasty a try yourself.